I am Leslie McGee with the Adult Protective Services Technical Assistance Resource Center, or the APS TARC. Welcome to our presentation, The Use of Forensics in Adult Protective Services, Implementing a Forensic Center, being presented today by Karl Urban, Candace Heisler, and Jason Burnett. You will hear a little bit more about each of them later in this presentation. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I do have to go over a few things. This webinar was created by the APS TARC, administered by WRMA Incorporated under contract number 140D0424F1178 from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Community Living, Administration on Aging. The views expressed in this publication do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the Administration for Community Living or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Please note, the models and information provided during this webinar do not serve as official guidance to comply with any part of the APS final rule. All information provided is done so for informational purposes only. Next slide, please. This presentation is also being hosted by the APS TARC. Our mission is to enhance the effectiveness of APS programs, and we do this by supporting our partners' use of data and analytics, applying research and evaluation to practice, encouraging the use of innovative practices and strategies, and providing APS programs with individualized technical assistance. Today's presentation is being recorded without a live audience. Should you have any questions after viewing this recording, please reach out to the APS TARC team using the contact information provided at the end of the presentation. We will be happy to discuss ways that we can assist you, as well as any questions you may have on this presentation. Next slide, please. At this time, I'm going to turn this discussion over to our first speaker, Karl Urban.
Hello, everybody. I am Karl Urban. I am a Senior Research Manager at the Adult Protective Services Technical Assistance Resource Center, and I am glad to be working with my two colleagues, Candace Heisler and Jason Burnett. Just to give you a little bit of a brief background on them, and they can correct me if I get any of this wrong. I have known Jason I guess since I actually look like I do in that photo that you see there. Back when I worked with the Texas APS program, he was with UTHealth doing research and has been doing very innovative best practice research in adult protective services for decades now, and have enjoyed working with him for a long time. Candace, I've not known as long. Candace is a retired prosecutor in San Francisco. She and I have worked together on some research projects and some workshops along with our colleague Shelley Jackson at the Department of Justice. Candace is a well-known, well-sought-after speaker, consultant, trainer in the area of elder abuse, particularly as it relates to issues with the criminal justice system and perpetrators, and I am pleased that they have agreed to help us with this webinar today. Anything you guys want to add to that description? We good? All right, so let's talk about what we're doing today. So we have written a technical assistance brief on the use of forensics in APS, and that brief will be coming out probably about the same time as this. And so what we wanted to do in this webinar was to go through some of the questions that the brief raised, and maybe as a prompt to get you to read the technical assistance brief when it comes out, and have a dialogue to answer the questions that you see here. First is, why did we do the brief in terms of our technical assistance and innovations research projects? What is forensic? Why is it important for APS? So how do you then apply it to APS? And then why did we focus specifically on forensic centers? Because the use of forensics is broader than just forensic centers, but we ended up focusing most of our attention on forensic centers. Why are forensic centers needed? How did they develop? What does the research say about whether forensic centers are efficacious in terms of making improvements in the lives of APS clients? And then finally, the most important question of all, as an APS program, okay, what do I need to know to be able to implement a forensic center? This is going to be a relaxed, unrehearsed conversation between me and Jason and Candace. I'm basically going to talk about some stuff and then get them to comment on it. So I'm like the announcer and they're the color commentators as we do this webinar. So with that said, first question then is, what are APS TARC best practices innovations research projects? And so you'll recall that graph that Leslie showed you a minute ago showed the 3 concentric circles overlapping with TA research and namers for APS. Part of what ACL wants us to do is to focus on areas of best practices and innovations and figure out how to translate that into technical assistance for APS programs. And that is what we are trying to do today. Every year we give ACL a long list of potential topics, and the first one that was chosen for this year for this project was on use of forensics in APS. And so that's how we got to our topic today. So let's focus in on it. What is forensics and why is it important for APS program? So what is forensics? As it says here, forensics is the establishment of a scientific basis for evidence in criminal investigations and legal proceedings. A couple of references I saw in the literature were very simply, forensics is where law and science intersect. And so that can have different implications for the world of APS. And so I will, at this point, see what Candace and Jason want to add to our understanding in a general sense of what is forensics. Maybe Candace first.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Coming from the criminal justice system, we often think in terms of case building, what is my evidence? And when we talk about the evidence, we're often thinking about what's the scientific basis for asserting a certain position or arguing a certain point of law. And so Karl's definition of, we think of forensics as kind of that soft spot, that intersection where law and science come together in order to answer legal problems and questions. So another way of thinking about it, and this actually comes from an article that was written in 2010, it's about the application of science to questions that arise in a legal system. And in thinking about forensics, it uses experts from a variety of disciplines in order to investigate and then resolve various cases, in our situation, of abuse or neglect of an older or vulnerable adult. And so as the prosecutor background person, what I'm thinking about forensic is, how do I prove elements of a crime? For APS, it's how do you establish a basis for confirming an allegation or making certain recommendations.
Jason, any thoughts or anything to add?
Yeah, I think, we also use it, right, to, everything Candace said in terms of building this sort of evidence towards that opinion, that decision, that determination. And, in the work that we do, mostly is around, things like capacity. So you still got to build the evidence, still got to use the science in it, and you still got to build it for that sort of legal setting where, if they do perhaps lack capacity, you got to have that evidence to support that in a very, very nice and, comprehensive way.
So thinking about it from a comprehensive way, the question is then, how is it applied in APS casework? And so when we looked at the literature, we saw a number of different ways that it's applied in casework. Injury patterns, lots of research in this area, starting with Dr. Mosqueda out at USC. Interviewing techniques, you see lots of training these days on forensic interviewing techniques. You see it in terms of forensic accounting in financial exploitation. And then, as Jason just referenced, you see it particularly in relationship to legal and medical experts to assist with client assessments. Jason or Candace, any thoughts on any of those?
The information on the slide is really helpful in getting us thinking about the more common way that most of us think about the term forensics. It's about specific ways of interpreting information or obtaining it. My experience working with APS programs around the country is it's pretty hard to imagine very many APS cases where forensics aren't relevant and critical to the investigation APS may conduct, how it arrives at a conclusion, or how it should intervene or can intervene in an effective way through a case plan. And so I think there's a lot of different ways APS uses various aspects of forensics. And if I were to take this list and just develop it a little bit further, when I think about injury patterns, you're right, Dr. Mosqueda did the two leading initial bruise studies, and those have been explored further. There are other studies that look at how do you distinguish a fall that's related to abuse from something that is accidental or may have some other reason for occurring. Interviewing techniques, increasingly APS is being asked to develop ways of conducting interviews with clients, with alleged perpetrators or persons of interest in ways that will survive scrutiny in other systems, including the civil and criminal justice system. And so these forensic interviewing techniques are using best practices to increase the amount of information that's gathered in ways that are not suggestive, and allow the person to provide the greatest quantity and quality of possible information. We also, in forensics, and APS does it too, it works with people like Jason and other experts to arrive at interpreting information it may have in helping understand documentation and records, and as Jason has highlighted, in assessing, first conducting, and then evaluating capacity for forensic purposes, courtroom purposes. I know Jason has particular interest and knowledge about a forensic accounting aspect of this. The only thing I want to end this discussion with is saying that we're going to turn shortly to teams. And in my head, teams are really how we take all this information and make sense of it in the context of meeting both legal needs and clinical needs and case needs of those who've been experiencing harm.
So Jason, you'll have a grant, I think, from ACL to do a forensic accounting project. Would you like to talk just briefly about that?
Yeah, so we finished that, and then the state of Texas picked up the program as a program, which is always nice and always what we want. But in terms of forensic accounting, we the way it works is similar to injury patterns, right? They're looking at records and looking at patterns of spending. They're not just looking for, hey, was there one, did this person, was there just one sort of expenditure that looks odd? It's over time. And so you really need those experts to go in and identify those patterns over time. What are those fluctuations? They're looking at also, forgery, those sorts of things. They're looking at different bank accounts, and that really takes a really important skill to be able to track those things down and understand, where all this money is sort of going. And if you loop in the, the interviewing techniques, that's also part of forensic accounting, right? They don't just go and look at records. They will also go sit down with folks and talk to them in a way to gather information, just as Candace mentioned, to get the information in a systematic way that doesn't, have bias. And so that can be used in legal proceeding because you have to have that sort of stuff to be able to prove up the case.
Okay. And so then when you're thinking about application of forensics to APS, it takes various forms. And I think these are forms that probably most of us are familiar with. It takes the form of a medical-based team where you're getting that expertise and that assessment of that particular victim of abuse or neglect. It takes the form of FAST teams, as they're often called, which is dealing with the accounting side of it, again, looking specifically at financial abuse cases, bringing together a group to mix the experts, as Jason referred to try to get a better understanding of the transactions that occurred, and at the same time deal with the capacity issues. So it's the mixture of the different needs from both the individual side as well as the process side in terms of what is happening. We're familiar with fatality or death review teams, which are looking at the situation that occurred and trying to do an assessment from the medical evidence, from the forensic markers, to understand what happened in a elder abuse related death so that the steps can be taken, the knowledge can be gained to prevent those kinds of things from happening in the future. And then the last two is what we really want to focus on today, which are community-based MDTs, which are groups that come together at the community level to address elder abuse issues with a focus on detection and education. And then in the case of what's going on, particularly in Texas, which are virtual networks which use communication technology to create a team or an approach to assist with client assessment for capacity, which is a critical determination in APS cases. So then the question becomes, okay, well, why did we focus on forensic centers in this technical assistance brief? And really, when we looked at the literature on this, what we found was that there was a pretty strong evidence base in the published research on the use of forensic centers in both geographically based communities as well as the forensic networks or the virtual networks. And so when you read the brief, you will see that they are focused on these forensic centers. And so now we want to talk about them in a little bit more detail. And so the big questions here are, what are forensic centers? Why are they needed? And how did they develop? So when we're talking about a forensic center, what we are talking about is what was referred to by one of the researchers as, and you see it in the quote here, the forensic center is an elegant MDT model. It brings together the resources and the experts of different types of professionals who hear cases and make recommendations. Maybe it's a little pedantic to tell you what an MDT is, but an MDT is a collaborative group of professionals who come together from different disciplines and work together to address complex cases of adult abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Jason or Candace, any thoughts on a forensic center and why they are needed? Candace, why don't you go first?
Thank you. So in the early days of elder abuse, and I'm not going to say I was right there at the beginning, but pretty early in the development of elder abuse, one of the pioneers of the field, a doctor by the name of Rosalie Wolfe, set the stage for thinking about how can we address the complex aspects of elder abuse. And early on, she said, and I think it's really the answer to this question is, collaboration, and in particular, multidisciplinary responses are really the hallmark of elder abuse intervention and response. And through those early writings, I think what she recognized is that no single professional has the expertise to understand, collect, analyze, and make the appeal for all of the different things that need to happen when elder abuse is suspected, and even more when it's detected. So what that has led to is a series of actions by communities across the United States developing various kinds of multidisciplinary responses. And the last slide really laid out a lot of those different kinds, which evolved to answer specific kinds of questions, like how do we do a better job understanding precursors to homicide, or what are some of the unique aspects of financial abuse cases, and why are they so hard for any single system to manage. And so what came out of those was first community level team, well, not first, but early on, community level teams that said, we're going to bring together community agencies, often social services, who were interacting with older adults, and were stumped because they didn't have the understanding of the resources to really address those questions. And so they would turn to other concerned entities that also dealt with older adults, present cases, and try to develop ideas for more effective interventions. But at the same time that communities were starting to do that, various professions and disciplines were doing that as well. So if we look back into about the early 1990s, medical assessment teams started to form at hospitals in Massachusetts and New York. And different kinds of teams have evolved ever since, including what we're now seeing as forensic centers, which started in about 2003 in Southern California. So what do they do, and what's different about them is who's involved. Community agencies may, in varying degrees, be involved, but in these different, more elegant models, if I can use that term, we're seeing an array of professionals and disciplines, a more focused and action-oriented collaboration, and where there is an expectation that members may be required or asked to provide specific services like conducting assessments, medical or capacity, identifying social service programs or eligibility for programs, actually taking on case management. And we're also seeing situations where those experts may not be involved in specific services within a case, but are generally providing expertise and background about, you might want to consider this. Have you thought about the police doing a civil standby? Have you thought about how connecting this person to this kind of service might improve their situation? So teams can form either or both functions. And then lastly, thinking about who are those various enhanced professionals. Virtually all of the teams that have developed have geriatric specialists. From the medical arena, they have experts able to conduct capacity assessments. They engage with civil legal organizations, forensic accountants, and in addition to criminal justice and social service professionals.
Jason, anything to add to that? I should have said in the beginning, Candace literally wrote the chapter in the book on this topic, which is why we asked her to be on this particular webinar. Jason, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just one thing about the MDTs, these forensic centers. One of the important aspects, I think, is that these folks get together, and it really helps prevent these sort of cases from stalling at any one individual sort of place, because they get to learn what the limitations are, and not limitations in a bad way, but everybody has to have their sort of scope of work, and they get to learn what the scope of work of these other agencies are, so they don't feel like, okay, we did our thing and they should do this. Well, if they can't, if a group can't do a certain thing, they get to learn that. They get to figure out who can do that sort of thing, so that it keeps these cases from just sort of stalling somewhere and falling through the cracks, and keeping these folks at prolonged risk. So I think that's a major one of the major benefits of having these MDTs and forensic
Yeah.
centers.
And we'll see that, I think, in some of the literature stuff that we will look at in a minute. So just to be a little bit more concrete. So, APS developed in the 60s and 70s, and as it evolved, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, there was an increasing recognition that of the criminal justice nature of elder abuse. And so APS programs began to take a more legalistic approach to their investigations. And so you had increases in civil and criminal referrals as a result of an APS case. And so, for example, perpetrator registries, which states are still adding, is a very much a civil remedy that's based on a criminal justice approach to this type of case. And so having started taking that more criminal justice type of approach to the cases, there was a recognition that, well, we need assistance with this type of approach. And so that's how they started to develop. There is a great article by the late Lori Stiegel that you can see when you get the brief, that you can look at, that gives you a very good history of how all of this development. The culmination in this trend was in 2000, the Department of Justice had a roundtable discussion on elder abuse justice, medical forensic issues relating to elder abuse and neglect. And the upshot of all those people coming together and talking was a recommendation for the need to develop forensic expertise and to consider developing forensic centers, as has been done in the child abuse field. By 2010, based on the work that the Department of Justice had been doing, that MT Connolly was doing, when the Elder Justice Act was passed, it mandated new grants for the creation of forensic centers. Candace, any comments on that history?
Really, I think the comments to this point and your points on this slide really highlight the evolution of thinking about the need for forensic centers. What I would add briefly is there are some real benefits to a holistic approach that is more expansive than what any single discipline is able to provide. It allows members of the team to look to one another to get additional information, and it allows sharing of records and information to avoid duplication of effort, more comprehensive responses, increase safety for the older adult who has been harmed, the professional safety for the professional who is conducting an investigation or an evaluation. And as a person who understands that we can't all spend 100% of our time on any single case, the fact that early use of a forensic center allows us to weed out cases that really are not going to come to certain ends, such as can't be prosecuted, or for which certain kinds of interventions would not be possible. So it may save time in that sense.
So in terms of the history then, different types of models developed in different communities. And so in California, through a grant, you saw a model developed that was referred to as a forensic center. And there have been a number of published articles on the development and the efficacy of those centers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. In New York, you saw something developed that was called an enhanced MDT, and I think Candace will talk about those a little bit as we go through this. There's not really a lot of literature published on those. But you also saw developments in Massachusetts and Minnesota and New Jersey, and the model has continued to expand across the country. And then in Texas, Texas being different as always, of course, you saw the development through the Teams Institute of a network approach to MDTs. And maybe Jason, just say a little bit about the history of that.
Yeah, so we were, we were doing these capacity assessments in Houston and the surrounding counties for, the local APS for close to 20 years. And then we were able to utilize technology to actually take what we've been doing here, and do it for the rest of the state using some video conferencing technology. And the same process that we use in person, we use, over the telecommunications, and we can talk about that a little bit more later.
Yeah, and we'll get to the detail on that in just a second. So then the question is, how do these forensic centers work? And so this is a graphic that we took directly out of one of the articles on how the California Elder Abuse Forensic Center works. And I'm not going to try to go through every aspect of this, so I encourage you to either pause the recording and look at this in some detail, or it is replicated in an appendix in the brief. So I will note a few things, though. The first thing is that note that there are different types of investigators and providers involved in this process in that first box up at the top, and that very much includes a contribution from the Adult Protective Services Program. The next thing to note is that there are different types of systems involved. You've got the justice system, you've got the APS system, you've got the Older Americans Act system. And what you're trying to do is to integrate how these systems work together. In the brief, we go into more detail about all of this from a systems perspective. The process is defined, as you see in that middle box, but I think you can also say that it is flexible. It is built upon having certain types of resources that can, again, vary from community to community. What you'll see in Jason's virtual network is a little bit different than what you see in the community-based one, but those resources require a commitment on the participants to make the system work. And then maybe the most important thing is at the bottom of the chart, and is you are trying to achieve certain types of outcomes. You've really kind of got process outcomes in terms of the contribution of the professionals, in terms of the impact on the community, but also you've got the very important client outcomes in terms of the vulnerable adults and the things that you're trying to achieve for them. Candace, anything you would say about the California model?
What I would say, first of all, this graphic is incredibly helpful in understanding the general flow. And this model, more or less, is the one that is applicable to each of the California Elder Abuse Forensic Centers, and there are multiple centers. When I think about New York and the New York enhanced MDTs, their system isn't that different in terms of how it does its work and what it attempts to accomplish and its outcomes. And so I think this is a good way of visualizing more or less how virtually any forensic center is going to function in addressing cases of elder abuse.
So let's turn to how then do you make this work when it's not community-based, but it's a network that's using a virtual process on a statewide basis in the case of Texas. And I will get Jason to describe what they do with the Team Fasten process in Texas.
Thanks, Karl. Yeah, so one of the main concern or one of the big things that we see in with Adult Protective Services, and I'm sure you all on the call or who are watching this this webinar are familiar with is capacity, which poses a big question mark in terms of care planning. And if you've ever worked some of these cases, you know that it's not that easy to go out. You can't just go to the doctor all the time and say, hey, can you do a capacity assessment? Can you give us a capacity evaluation? And knowing that, as I mentioned earlier, we started doing these in Texas early, but 1995 and all the way up through 2015, locally, and then we decided let's try to expand this out. And so in order to do that, we needed certain things. We needed technology, but if we kind of follow the circles to the left, for this collaboration, this FAC and this Forensic Assessment Center Network is a program between Adult Protective Services and UTHealth and the Texas Abuse and Mistreatment Institute and Collaboratory. And so what it requires is obviously we got to have the folks that we need to assess, and that's we get those from APS. So APS has to be involved. They have to have their technology, because if this is going to be remote, it's going to be video conferencing. We got to be able to see the person in the home. In terms of how this thing gets funded is there's purchase client services. So this is actually considered a service to the client because we're doing an assessment for them so we can help with care planning. We provide the physicians, the doctors, the team that does these assessments, that coordinates. We've got the Forensic Assessment Center Network, which is a online portal, which I'll tell you about in just a second, so that we can have this communication, have the workflow flow through that network in a protected way, because we don't want to just be sending people's records out. Then UTHealth, of course, we have to have our technology so we can remote in and see the person, they can see us, because this is a video conferencing approach. And then we used either Teams or FaceTime. So we got to have that sort of technology, which is encrypted, so that once again, we're not exposing people, their information, and not having that sort of stuff. We want to keep that private and secure as possible. So we use all of that to be able to provide this virtual service or remote service to APS around the state, all 254 counties in Texas. And we were able to pilot that in 2015 to 2017 to make sure it even would work out. And then we found it works, and we're able to actually connect with these folks in their homes and do it just the same as we would do it if we were in person.
And so, Jason, you have a contract with the state APS program to set up and provide this network to the state APS program, and that's the way that works.
Yep,
this is what contract you just described.
Yep.
All right. Just want to make sure that's clear. All right. So continue on, Jason. Say a little bit more.
Okay. So just so people are clear, our Forensic Assessment Center Network, the way we've set this up, there was a Child Protective Services had a Forensic Assessment Center Network. We built the adult piece to it through funds with Adult Protective Services. And so all of our cases flow through this central network, which allows, APS has access to it. They push their cases into this network and say and that'll alert us that they need a capacity assessment. What county? We have a coordinator that then gets this case, nurse coordinator. She gets this case. She staffs it. She talks with APS workers. She talks with our physicians, gets it set up, and then all the communication on these cases flows back and forth through this portal. It's a real easy portal. That's where we put our determination letters, is where we retrieve files from APS, is where we send files to them, where we send notes. It's almost like electronic medical record in a sense, but it's HIPAA compliant, and that makes it really easy for us to have communication. Another thing that it does, it allows APS workers to put it in there and then just sort of forget about it and go on and do their other 40 cases that they're working on. And then whenever we make a change in that case, it sends them an alert, says there's been a change to your case. That way they don't have to keep tracking it. And so it's a really nice system that allows us to just keep that communication going in real time and also keep it very protected.
So the key roles then are the APS caseworker whose case needs the medical assessment, and they put the information into the portal.
Yep.
Your clinician who is doing the assessment, and the nurse coordinator that is making sure the whole thing works. Is that correct?
Yep. So APS puts it in. We have a nurse coordinator or myself that'll go in, and we'll get the case. We'll look at it, make sure the information is there, reach out to the worker, make sure there's no other remaining information that's needed. We'll set up the assessment with our clinician, with the APS worker. And then what ends up happening is we give some documents that APS will take out, such as some of our basic assessments, because some of them are written. but most of it's interview because we're doing capacity. So what ends up happening is the APS worker then goes out to the home. They're in the home. They set the computer up, the camera up with the client. We remote in. We're all in on Teams. We do our assessment over Teams, and then we do our final determination letter, put it back into the FACN system, and then APS downloads that, puts it into their system.
Do y'all do anything more than capacity assessments with this network?
We used to do record reviews. So we did record reviews for and we still do some of those for APS. You know, the majority of what we're doing are capacity assessments, but we will do some record reviews where APS can put it in and say, hey, can you take a look at this and give us your sort of interpretation of are we missing anything in terms of our care planning? Can you look at a lot of it's looking at health records, that sort of thing. So we'll do that. We're also able to do some medical assessment, but it'll flow through here. But then medical assessments have to be done in person. You can't do a medical assessment over telehealth. Well, at least we can't do that for the things that we would then be making opinions on. I mean, you can look at somebody and say, okay, they look like they're breathing, heavy, that sort of thing. You can look at color, you can look at bruising, but in terms of, we can't take blood pressure, we can't do those things. And so we're pretty limited on the medical side.
Okay. And we'll come to some of the legal ethical questions related to all this in just a minute. Candace, any questions for Jason or comments on what's going on in Texas with the network?
I do have one question, and it was in the course of your discussions that it came to mind. Let's assume that you've done an assessment, and that assessment is part of a case that is going to be the subject of a guardianship, for example. Does APS or does the nurse or does the physician who conducted the capacity evaluation have to come to court and testify?
So we'll fill out a CME, and then, for guardianship cases, very seldom do we call to court. Now we have been to court, and it's never been an issue for us. But most of the time we're not going to court. And to be honest with you, we don't end up doing a whole lot of guardianship cases. And that's a great thing for APS, right? They're finding that alternative sort of source for these folks. But in cases where, there have been cases where we do go to court, but it's not that often, and it tends to work out just fine.
CME,
and then
that's a Texas term. What's a CME? Candace, we'll get right back to you.
Certified medical exam. Certified medical exam. Yeah.
As part of the guardianship process. Candace.
The other question that I had is, in putting aside save time in travel, the actual assessment itself, how does it compare in duration and complexity to one that would be conducted in person? Is there a difference?
So same process, whether it's in person or video conferencing. We still use the same assessments, same interview process. It cuts down, like you said, on travel, and it really cuts down on those cases where they decide they don't want to do it. So you go from a 2-hour travel and billing to a 30-minute sort of billing type of thing. But in terms of hours of completing, if you cut out the travel time, you're down to maybe 4 hours, to get these sort of things done. So you're 2 hours doing the assessment, hour and a half doing the assessment. That's either in person or video conferencing, and then another 2 or 3 hours writing up the determination letter. So anywhere from 4 to 6 hours. But when you're doing it in person, especially in Harris County, where we are, you could drive 2 hours to get somewhere and then 2 hours back, yes. And you're still, so it just kind of it varies, but it is shorter. And the turnaround time for these assessments, we get 7 days to do them. We turn them once we've done the assessment, we're turning around in 2 to 3 days.
Thank you.
So yep. Candace is kind of anticipating our next section, which is to talk about, okay, so does this work or not? And what does the research say about the the effectiveness of these types of approaches. And I think we will probably flow through this a little bit quicker than we have up to now. But let's look at this. Let's look at this very specific question about efficacy. And so we're going to think about it from both the community-based perspective as well as the network perspective. And we'll start with the community-based again. And so when we looked at the literature, kind of the findings were split more or less into two different types. There was the experimental research where they had a research design, and they were looking at some more defined outcomes. And then there was sort of the softer process kinds of findings. And let's look at the softer process kinds of findings first. And you have heard some of this already in the discussion that we have had up to now. And so what you see is that you're bringing together professionals from all of these different disciplines. And just the fact that you're bringing them together is a good process outcome for this whole process. You're giving a forum for case input, evaluation, and cross-training so that you're, from a systemic perspective, identifying the barriers that help people work together to address what the individual client needs may be. The fact that you have all of the experts together working on the same case means that you're getting a more comprehensive review. You're facilitating the input of multiple perspectives. You're getting to that thing we like to call a holistic assessment in APS. Ultimately, all of these people have to work together for the good of the client. The process facilitates increasing these working relationships. And then when you're looking at positive outcomes, say in the case of financial exploitation, you're stopping the exploitation, you're seeing the managing the risk of future victimization, and you're seeing better recovery of lost assets. And then maybe the most important thing here in a way is that this is a continuous learning process in terms of the people that participate are able to take what they learned from talking about one specific case in the forensic center setting and applying that information that they learned, applying that relationship that they developed on an informal basis to other cases that they are working. And so you get the spillover ancillary positive impact effect from working through all of this. Candace, any comments on this?
Well, these findings come out of some of the research. In talking with some of the programs in New York and in California, anecdotally, because they don't have formal evaluations, these are the very same highlights that they have identified as valuable. The other one that came up again and again is the increased understanding of what each discipline does and increased trust between the professionals who are part of the center.
Okay, so that's the soft process finding kind of side of this. For the California Forensic Centers, they did some experimental research kinds of findings, and I want to run through those real quickly. So the cases that went to the Forensic Center were significantly more likely to be submitted to the district attorney. So that's a good thing. But the proportion of the cases in which the district attorney then filed charges was not significantly different, nor did the proportion of cases with a successful plea or result in a successful plea or conviction. So you're getting more cases referred, but as always with that type of APS case going to criminal justice, sometimes it's difficult for criminal justice to process that. And Candace may have a comment on that in a minute. So cases that were referred to the Forensic Center are significantly more likely to be referred to guardianship. But as Jason referred, guardianship is not always the desired outcome in these cases. And so the proportion referred cases that needed conservatorship did not differ significantly between the Forensic Center and the APS cases. I think this was already referred to a little bit. Cases heard by the Forensic Center took longer on average, and the processing costs for those particular cases were higher than for a usual APS case. Took longer, cost more. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It certainly was a finding that needs to be taken into consideration. And I think Candace may have a comment on that. Here's the deal, though. Yeah, they may have taken longer and they may have cost more, but what you ended up doing was reducing recurrence significantly in these particular cases. And so when you look at the reason the authors thought that was happening, they believe the reduction was potentially due to you're getting appropriate referrals for prosecution and conservatorship. And so here's a summary. Law enforcement referrals increased, but they didn't increase the proportion being the operative word, of cases with filed charges. Guardianship referrals increased, but they didn't have a greater rate of acceptance. Recurrence was significantly reduced, and the cases took longer and cost a lot more. Candace, you have thoughts and comments on this? I'm just guessing.
Well, I have a couple of takeaways. When I first looked at these findings, I was a bit concerned. What I think these findings fail to illuminate or don't provide insight into is, first, what is a successful outcome of a criminal case? We often think about conviction, but there are other successful outcomes that don't result in conviction, but that occur because of the involvement of the criminal justice system. Increasingly, our focus is changing from did I get a conviction to how did this affect the quality of the victim's life? How did this better align with what the victim wanted to see happen? And so I would be cautious about, did the number of convictions increase? Because I think it's much more nuanced than a simple number. The second is acknowledging that these cases, when they go through all the different experts and the consideration of a forensic center, take longer, and because of the longer cost, involve more time, which equates to money. However, what the centers are doing is when they get involved, and they're getting involved in the more complex cases that have been difficult to resolve by lesser efforts, they're getting in, they're doing what needs to be done. They're doing it once, and then they're actually getting an outcome that relieves suffering and represents a measure of holistic outcome and justice. And so I don't see this as a suggestion that forensic centers aren't effective. I see it as understanding, do you want to pay once and get it done and think about reducing future suffering and the costs on professional organizations, the person harmed and their family and the community at large? Do you want to do that once, or do you want to keep having to go back because you didn't really get everything you might have gotten through a forensic center process and just tried to deal with the situation immediately in front of you?
And I think of those takeaways, the one that resonates the most with me is we often think about the criminal justice system being measured by conviction when it's really not. It's really about justice, as the name would imply, and the most appropriate thing from a justice perspective in an APS case particularly is not always conviction. It's sometimes a lot more complicated than that. There needs to be other processes to work together to get to those other types of outcomes that are maybe more appropriate in terms of justice than just simply conviction. That's not to say that conviction is not appropriate at times, but it's not always the most appropriate outcome from a justice perspective in terms of APS. Let's now talk then about team, how do you say it, Jason? Facken? Is that how you say it?
Yeah, we call it FACN or FACN, however you want to, however you want to say
So
it.
what's y'all's effectiveness research shown?
So, we haven't done any sort of randomized control trial or anything like that, but we've definitely shown that, and things you would expect is we went from doing about 80 to 100 of these cases around around our local area in a year because of staffing, because of just sort of things like that, having to drive out there, those sort of things, to doing over 500 or more a year of these. And that doesn't mean, you're just rapidly going through these. We're still using very comprehensive methods, but we're able to reach a much broader group of people who need these services around the state. So we're able to do a lot more of those. Some of the big takeaways that people always ask, things like what Candy mentioned was, it's not that you're going to drastically reduce the amount of time it takes to do these cases, because you're still going to do comprehensive work the same way you were doing it. You just cut out some of that drive time, so the cost is less. And you also, like I said, you reduce those sort of 30% of cases say, I don't want to do it. Right. So we got 30% refusal rate, but I don't think that's news to anybody's ears when you're trying to get capacity assessments with APS cases. But some other important findings, people always ask is, well, okay, so if you're doing these, and this was one of those court-based sort of questions, they were like, okay, well, how comprehensive can these be, right? And so we went and sat with, some judges in San Antonio, and we said, well, here's what we can give you with good evidence, with forensic evidence, and they go, okay, if you can give us all that, we're good with it, right? Because it's very comprehensive, and so the data that we get is compelling. But we also see that, when we look at our data, we're not seeing that more people are getting identified as lacking capacity in either one area or all areas. In either way, we're doing it. So when we're doing it in person or we're doing it through video conferencing, we're seeing very similar patterns in terms of our determination, our opinion of whether somebody lacks capacity. So it's not one of those fly by night sort of, hey, you're just doing this really quickly just to get a case done. No. And that's a great concern. But we're very comfortable knowing that that's not what we're finding. We're not finding that people are just being deemed to lack capacity because we're missing information. We still get to see the home and those sort of things. So those things give us comfort in knowing that what we're doing is efficacious. It's being done the same way, and we're seeing similar results. And so we feel very confident in this approach.
And so I guess I would emphasize that last point, which is sort of that middle box on the bottom, is that what you end up with is a process where there is consistency in the way it is done, consistency in the outcome, because you have a consistent team that is doing the process. Candace, any thoughts or comments on Texas outcomes?
No, I think this is really impressive to understand how much it can be accomplished. There is one thought, and that is, I very much admire what Texas has been doing and how it has figured out a solution to the geographic demands that many communities and states have of small population groups far flung. I would
go ahead.
And it may be that this is instead of saying this later on, but I would always want to talk with my prosecutors about any time they may need to use a capacity evaluation done in this way to make sure that it meets local case law and statutory requirements and is going to be deemed admissible.
And Jason, it sounds like y'all had those very conversations.
Yeah, we haven't had any issues to date.
So, and Candace, you sort of hinted towards this. So then the question is, okay, well, what can I do to implement a forensic center if I am an APS program? And so this is where we want to kind of wind up today. So the thing about community-based forensic centers is, for the most part, they and there's probably a couple of exceptions around the country, they are for the most part not implemented by APS programs. APS programs, however, are a key partner in that process. And so as we were looking at the literature, a couple of things jumped out about this. How do I implement it? You have to have a champion in the community that takes on the responsibility of ensuring the success of this particular project. And that forensic center champion can be different organizations within the community. I encourage you to read the brief to get some sense of who those are. The other thing is a process thing, and that's developing trust and collegiality and respect as a part of that process is essential to the success of the community-based forensic center. Candace, any comments on the implementation, what it takes to really implement one of these successfully?
I've talked to a lot of different programs, and one of the themes that I hear again and again is APS is a critical participant in any of these forensic centers. In many cases, APS is the primary source of cases that go to the center. They can be educators for the team. They generally have a lot of expertise on local services and benefits programs. And they are forensic centers where APS gets more reports of abuse coming to them can be key in getting those cases to other parts of systems more effectively. APS and many of the programs with which I have spoken actually administers and even hosts the forensic center, and they are usually a source of significant funding in some of the ways that Jason described, in that they may be the agency that has the funds to pay for a medical assessment or to pay for the capacity assessment or to pay for the forensic accounting services. So there are key program benefits for APS, but they are critical players.
So turning then to the forensic network, some particular questions for Jason. Jason, what are the technology considerations? How did you say this actually works?
Oh, we use Teams, just like, just like if you're having a Teams meeting, everybody connects to Teams, APS caseworkers in the home with the older adult. They set them up. We're able to see them. They interact with us through through Teams. So we do those assessments when the APS is there. If we need them to do something like hand a form, they take some forms with them. We ask them to hand them a certain form. Older adult fills it out, that sort of thing. So we're able to do that. All over Teams, the whole interview's over Teams. We have learners, we're at a medical school, and it's always good to train up the next generation of people so we can have them out there doing this. So we have learners that join in, and that's a great thing. We can have language, we can bring in the language line if we need an interpreter. They're on there as well to be able to help that, be part of that assessment. In terms of staffing and cost, one of the things we've always run into with these capacity assessments and that delayed things was when you don't have dedicated staff, you're having to go find some physician and pull them off of service to actually then go find time to drive across town and do this sort of thing. And if you don't have those folks available, how do you even get them? But if you do have them available, how do you get them out of their service and walk away from that? So having dedicated time and funding to support that dedicated time is really important for making this, making this work. And then in terms of, the ethical considerations, I mean, we're doing everything by, what the Texas Medical Association says we should be doing in terms of, who can do capacity assessments, who can make these determinations. We're doing things with, on our technology, making sure everything's encrypted so that we're ethical there. We get consent, brief consent from the APS client before we actually do the interviews with them. And so everything's really nicely woven together to make sure we're doing things on on an ethical standpoint. And then once again, we're using forensics. We're using, and that's why we call it a forensic assessment center network, forensic evaluations, because we're using these forensic interview techniques. We're using standardized assessments, and we're also using the literature to support what we're saying, what we're finding, especially when it comes with medical conditions that may be impacting, the person's ability to make decisions on their own. We don't just rule out, oh, you couldn't make a decision. We look at the literature. Is it, what could be accounting for this? So if it's reversible, we'll say that. So, and that's where it all comes together to make a nice package for doing this sort of work.
Okay. So final implementation considerations, then they did a nice little chart in one of the articles on the community-based forensic centers out in California. And I encourage you to look at this. And so with this, I'm just mainly putting this here for reference for you. Some of the lessons are a number of things that we have touched on so far. And so you have those. What are the lessons learned in the Community Forensic Center? And I think you've heard a number of those as we've gone through this today. And Jason, I would ask you the same question. What are some of the lessons learned from the FACN model for you guys?
In terms of implementation, if we're speaking specific to that, I think, it's really important to have stakeholder buy-in. APS got to be involved. It's nice to have that common mission. When you've done this work together or not, it's good to come together and understand what the needs are of APS and what their perspective is. It's always about protecting the client. So you want to build everything around protecting that client, and then having the ability to, have good communication between the programs, flexibility. Some things we learned is that, yeah, you can have technology, because we had to, we put in some hearing devices, APS ordered some hearing devices stuff to support this program. And then we had a plan, to have workers check things out and things like that. But that didn't end up working out because it added extra burden to the workers. And so you got to be really, one of the big lessons we learned is we always got to be really considerate of the burden that it places on the workers. Is it additional work? Is it, and we've minimized that as much as possible. They're already going to be out there. So while you're out there, take these forms, and they're minimally involved. So those sorts of lessons were really important for us. And then also, it is replicable. We've seen it, being done in Ohio now and some other places. And it is, I think it's more cost effective than something like with, if you're in Arizona and you got to send a person 4 or 5 hours away to go stay in some other city to do a capacity assessment. That's not that cost effective or efficacious.
So can this work across state lines? I've asked you this question before.
Only if you have a medical license in the other state. So yeah, because this is it's a medical decision, medical determination, which, and they've loosened it a little bit to who can do it. For a long time, it was just physicians. Now you can have nurse practitioners, do it, and in some other places, psychologists and that sort of thing. But in terms of, for at least specifically in the state of Texas, you got to have a state of Texas license.
And so then final thought is there's a lot of detail in the brief on a number of the different questions that we've talked about today, some of which we have gotten to, some of which we have not gotten to. And so when the brief comes out, we strongly encourage you to read it. I suspect you may have questions that we've not answered in the brief. And so I encourage you to reach out to us and see if we can answer your questions, or if we can't answer your questions. At this point, we know who the experts are in the field. We can point you in the right direction. And then we have our most important thought. A number of you probably know Dr. Carmel Dyer, who was the head of the Team Institute in Texas. And so she was both a mentor and a friend and a colleague to Candace, who has worked in Houston for a long time, Jason's former boss. And I remember going down to Houston when I was working with the Texas APS program, and Carmel and I would have some wonderful dinners together talking about how we can improve the Adult Protective Services program in Texas. And so we dedicate this webinar to her memory. And Candace or Jason, I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that or not.
I'll just say not only was she a very dear friend, but she introduced me to this world of both elder abuse and elder abuse forensics. And it's one of the many debts I owe her for the rest of my days.
Yep. And I'll just add, I always tell people she raised me in this field, and I wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't for her.
Here is how to get a hold of us, as well as some of the APS TARC materials if you are not familiar with them. And thank you for watching this webinar, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.